I'll hand over to Pete to give us the last presentation, which is on the RAC work on restriction of nonylphenol. And then I think you'll have a complete picture of more or less everything that's been going on recently in this area, either specifically related to nonyl and octylphenol or in general terms related to endocrine disruption. So, Pete, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tim. So we've got a few extra minutes in the agenda before lunch, so just enough to get this one in. So Tim mentioned already that there's two sort of important documents in terms of the regulation under REACH of these substances, on nonylphenol at least. So it's the MSc opinions, and then it's the RAC opinion on the restriction proposal on nonylphenol and nonylphenol ethoxylates in textiles that was submitted by Sweden in September 2013. And this was a restriction proposal to prevent the placing on the market of textile clothing or any fabrics essentially containing nonylphenol or nonylphenol ethoxylate that could be washed in water. And it was to address the risk mainly from imported textiles that released nonylphenol or nonylphenol ethoxylates during their service life, so during washing. And so part of the normal process, so when a restriction proposal is received from a member state, it's subject to an evaluation by RAC and SAAC, and where they develop an opinion, taking into account the dossier that was submitted, but also comments from the public consultation that runs during that opinion-making phase. So the RAC duly adopted their opinion by consensus, so there were no minority opinions associated with that opinion in June 2014. And those bullet points there highlight the elements that make up an opinion on a restriction proposal. But what I will talk today is about how RAC went about their evaluation of the proposal in terms of the identified hazard and the exposure assessment and the risk characterization that was presented in that dossier. Just to highlight at the top that all of the various documents are available on the ECHA website, so you won't be able to make a note of that now, I'm sure, but you'll be able to link through when we circulate the presentations afterwards. So in terms of the identified hazard and risk, the restriction was based on the following premise. I should say that I've taken as much as possible verbatim from the RAC opinion itself, and this is pretty much verbatim from the RAC opinion. So the premise was that EU water bodies are at risk from nonylphenol ethoxylate degradation products, including effects arising from their combined toxicity, so mixtures of different nonylphenol ethoxylate degradation products and ED properties, and the specific substances that were highlighted as contributing to this risk were nonylphenol itself, a short-chain nonylphenol ethoxylates, and also short-chain nonylphenol ethoxycarboxylates. The significant source of these substances was considered to be textiles, particularly those imported, as they can release these substances whilst they're washed in water, and then these substances degrade to nonylphenol and shorter chain ethoxylates and ethoxycarboxylates in the environment or during wastewater treatment. And then the restriction to limit the concentration in textiles was considered to reduce these risks significantly while still allowing the supply of textiles to the EU where the nonylphenol ethoxylates were present unintentionally. So in terms of the evaluation of hazard, the dossier submitter, Sweden, had derived nonylphenol PnEX for both the freshwater and marine compartments based on a reasonably extensive data set of studies reporting what RAC referred to as conventional apical endpoints. They derived, the dossier submitter derived PnEX based both on deterministic assessment factor approaches and also probabilistic approaches using species sensitivity distribution. Just to highlight, I don't know, will that pointer reach? No, it won't. So in terms of the freshwater, other one, oh, the first one. Yeah, in terms of the freshwater, there was a range of PnEX predicted, but it was dependent on use of different assessment factors, and there was an approach to take account of additional uncertainty because of the ED properties of nonylphenol with an additional assessment factor of 10 in the freshwater environment. For the marine environment, they're very much lower, the concentrations predicted for the PnEX. And again, there's a large range here because of the use of additional assessment factors to account for wider taxonomic diversity in the marine environment, and also these additional assessment factors of 10 for ED. In terms of the probabilistic approaches with species sensitivity distributions, there was a freshwater compartment by itself, and then also a combined value that combined the data sets for freshwater and the marine compartment of about 0.42 micrograms per litre, which is actually quite similar to the value that Helen just mentioned for the framework directive EQS. So in addition to these conventional apical endpoints, the dossier submitter reported observations of potentially endocrine-mediated effects below the most sensitive apical NOEC values, and the dossier submitter also considered that it was too difficult to derive a threshold for the ED properties. So RAC evaluated this approach and the data, and they made various observations, which I will summarise now. So the RAC questioned whether or not there was a need for separate PNEC for freshwater and marine compartments, and we'll hear about that a little bit later. In terms of fish, and fish specifically, there were indications for the endocrine-mediated effects to occur at concentrations about an order of magnitude lower than the traditional apical endpoints. And in fact, RAC further evaluated a number of studies reporting ED-relevant endpoints. For example, this Schwegler et al. Study that they report in Annex 1 to their opinion, that has a LOEC, and it's an unbounded LOEC, so there's no NOEC derived from this study of 1 micrograms per litre for a transgenerational effect on larval mortality in rainbow trout. So that wasn't part of the apical endpoint data sets, but they was highlighted as maybe some ED-relevant effects occurring below these apical endpoints. In other taxonomic groups, and mollusks and echinoderms specifically identified really, RAC noted observations again of effects on non-traditional endpoints at concentrations in the range of 0.1 to 1 microgram per litre. So these are effects below those apical NOECs. However, those effects weren't conclusively considered to be endocrine-related based on the information that was available in terms of the endocrinology of the test organisms and the endpoints that were being reported. Some quotes again from the opinion that are very relevant for the context here. So RAC agreed that the ED-relevant arguments justify that these substances come under particular scrutiny, and then in this acknowledgement that there's this ongoing debate about how ED effects should be considered for hazard or risk-based approaches. At the time that this opinion was being made, the Commission services were developing the paper that Enrique had presented to us earlier, so that was acknowledgement that the Commission services were doing this work, and therefore, given that, RAC considered that it's premature in this specific case to give an opinion on whether or not it's possible to derive safe exposure level for ED effects in NP. In terms of the conclusions that they could make, so for these traditional apical endpoints, this PNEC of 0.4 micrograms per litre for non-olphenol was derived, and that was applied for both the freshwater and the marine compartments considered to be appropriate for risk assessment. In terms of the ED properties, there was a conclusion that it was difficult to precisely quantify a threshold for ED effects. In terms of fish, that PNEC lowered by a factor of maybe 5 might be protective in fish, and this is explained in Annex 2 of the opinion. But in terms of other taxa, despite any specific indications, and this is from the literature that was available, RAC cannot preclude that a lower threshold would be appropriate to protect other taxonomic groups that currently lack adequate testing protocols or data in the database that was available when this evaluation was made. So they couldn't rule out that a lower PNEC might be needed for other taxonomic groups. So therefore, the PNEC that was used and derived as part of the RAC evaluation was simply used as a pragmatic means to evaluate the proposed restriction. So is there an EU-wide risk? So if the RCR was one using this conventional apical PNEC, then there was an EU-wide risk that would require an EU-wide response in terms of a restriction. And then any risks identified, the additional risks from the ED properties of NP and any combined effects of mixtures of the different short-chain ethoxylates and the ethoxycarboxylates would be greater. So this was the rationale when they did the evaluation. So the traditional PNEC was insufficient to address all the uncertainties, and then RAC cannot offer any opinion about whether or not the proposed PNEC is sufficiently protective of all relevant hazards posed by nonylphenol. Just very briefly on these other relevant nonylphenol ethoxylate degradation products, because those previous conclusions really just related to nonylphenol. So RAC agreed that the short-chain nonylphenol ethoxylates and nonylphenol ethoxycarboxylates contributed qualitatively to the overall toxic effects in the environment, including ED effects. The basis for the quantification proposed by the dossier submitter, which was this toxicity equivalent factor approach, was concluded to have significant uncertainties, and it was clearly overestimating, in terms of the RAC opinion, the contribution of toxicity of these sort of longer chain nonylphenol ethoxylates. And then it was concluded that this TEF approach for nonylphenol and the nonylphenol ethoxycarboxylates adds disproportionate uncertainty to a quantitative hazard estimates. And then in terms of conclusions on exposure and risk, because the exposure data was based on the data reported under the Framework Directive, so nonylphenol is present in some European freshwaters at concentrations exceeding the PNEC of 0.4 micrograms per litre. But the majority of water bodies appear to be exposed to a lower concentration. The approach to estimate the concentration of the ethoxylates and the ethoxycarboxylates based on nonylphenol monitored in the environment was considered to be a useful screening tool, but it was likely to result in significant overestimations of concentrations of these nonylphenols and ethoxycarboxylates. And then overall, it can be assumed that at least a small proportion of freshwater bodies and some marine bodies in more than one member state are at risk from nonylphenol based on that PNEC of 0.4. And of course, other nonylphenol ethoxylate degradation products will add to the risk. There's uncertainty about the margin of safety afforded by this PNEC, and therefore only minimum risks can be identified from this risk characterization using nonylphenol. So my final slide then, just a summary really. So the RAC opinion on the restriction proposal for nonylphenol ethoxylates gives a good basis for how RAC would approach an evaluation of a threshold for an ED substance in the future, i.e. as part of an application for authorization. The RAC opinion does not conclude on the threshold, non-threshold nature of the ED properties of nonylphenol, but it does provide an indication of the types of uncertainties that would need to be addressed to demonstrate that a PNEC would be protective of all the relevant taxonomic groups and possibly compartments as well. And these toxic equivalent factor approaches have been evaluated previously as uncertain. And that's all I had to say, Tim.